Welcome back. You're watching Future of Global Trade, and we are focusing on emerging market trade corridors. Let me start with Gopal. So, Gopal, before we talk more about the bilateral trade agreements, Anis made an interesting point about how agriculture is still a hot potato as far as global trade talks are concerned.
Right.
Your Cargill, what's your view on the food debate? And the cabinet passed the food security bill in India, so which means food for all is the promise the government is making. So, what's your take on how should India go about securing its food future?
I think free trade is essential as far as food security is concerned, and that's something which cannot be undermined. Just give you an example, which is you can't transport Brazil into Saudi Arabia. You have to trade.
Right.
You have to bridge the gap between the demand and supply, and that's where trade really plays a very significant role. And Cargill believes that free trade is something which creates food security.
Right. So, James, if I look at some data that's coming out of the World Trade Organization, there's some evidence to show that not enough of these bilateral trade agreements are actually being utilized or acted upon. So why is that?
Well, I think the critical thing here is to actually begin looking at the trade flows themselves. So what's going to drive trade and why are people undertaking trade? So there needs to be a reason to effectively make the exchange in the first place, which is why we focused very heavily on trade corridors and identifying where those trade corridor opportunities are, because business is out there to actually look for those opportunities and to look at how they can best build on them. So from our perspective, I think it's more a question of looking at the key trade corridors, the opportunities for growth moving forward,
right,
and how business actually manages to grow effectively through export. And particularly for Indian companies looking, yes, at Asia, where there's a very significant opportunity, the future opportunity, as we talked about very briefly, in Latin America, but also some of the developed market opportunities, remembering the United States will still be a very significant player,
right,
as would the European Union in absolute terms. So I think that the key is actually, let's identify the trade flows that are going to be significant, and importantly, the fact that we're moving or evolving up the value chain, whether it's to mineral manufacturers, so key parts around metals, whether it's automobiles, where are the markets for those? Because that will ultimately drive what trade takes place under a trade agreement, or in fact, in any terms.
Okay. So, Anis, how much do you think Indian companies are actually looking at this whole Latin American opportunity? We, of course, have an episode totally dedicated to that, but quickly, at this stage, how do you assess India's interest in Latin America?
Well, two aspects really. One is direct interest, setting up a company, perhaps a subsidiary or a branch model going in. There's a lot of interest from that perspective. I think a lot of our services companies are already there. But if we just focus on the trade aspect for a second, I think in our export basket, if I'm not wrong, Latin America has grown from about a 4% to a 9%, right? 9% isn't good enough, especially when you're looking at
Right,
at a region of the world which is developing at a rapid rate. So I think a lot more probably needs to be done from that perspective.
Right. Susanta, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, to James' point that he was highlighting about the people and the middle class, which is growing, right, and the affluence and the lifestyle is changing in the countries, and this is something that every industry has to take into cognizance, and even the bilateral trades or basically agreements, all this have to take into cognizance of which is the country that the next destination is. So, and there are pockets, emerging markets, you cannot see emerging markets as a whole, right? Emerging markets, for example, from a farmer point of view, emerging markets are classified into 3 tiers, right? Tier 1, straight away China, correct? Tier 2, you have the India, Brazil, Russia.
Right.
And then Tier 3, you have the other countries. South Africa may fit into Tier 2, right? So that's how, and then within Tier 3 again, there are pockets where some of the countries, the economies, they're growing faster. There is some more of lifestyle changes that is happening in the people because of the middle class affluence which is taking place. This has to be taken into consideration from a government policy perspective, from the bilateral trade perspective, from the corporate strategy perspective.
Right, okay. So, with global trade, with world trade, as Indian companies move out to new markets, also comes the whole issue of risks, right? There's a currency risk, there's a regulatory risk, and there's also a larger political risk, like we've seen in the case of some Indian companies, like in Bolivia, for example. So, Gopal, let me start with you. How well are Indian companies placed today to manage these risks?
I think there is a bit of a challenge. At least this is my perspective, in terms of handling volatility and risk management. And I think there is a lot of I would say, partnerships and collaborations required by the Indian companies with banks or financial institutions or specialist organization to manage risk.
Right.
And I think that's a significant part of strategy which needs to be ramped up.
Right. Susanto, from your perspective?
So there's no doubt the cost of compliance is going to go up. Absolutely. There's no shortcuts in this operation. These markets individually, they are different. You got to understand those markets. You got to understand the policies. You got to understand the bureaucracy, that how it works. If you have to establish, because business is all about timing to market. Correct?
Exactly.
So if there's a delay for more than a reasonable time frame that you get out of the market, you don't get to see the market at all. So that is very important. Right, and it's pharma is always equally applicable to pharma as well.
Absolutely, right. So James, I'm going to let you have the last word. If you were advising the CEO of a large Indian company, how would you ask him, or what would you tell him to go about this whole global trade opportunity? What would you tell him to do and not to do?
Well, I think fundamentally it's about identifying the corridors. To your point, it's about making sure the risks are understood, trusted counterparties, and making sure that the infrastructure is in place such that whether it's trade, whether it's acquisition, whether it's services, is actually supported in the local market or markets in which they're operating. But I think the opportunities are very, very significant. And indeed, the future of global trade is going to change very rapidly, but presents great opportunities.
Right.
One of the significant aspects which Indian companies should also remember is that they need to build a reputation, a brand, and at the same time build credibility.
Okay. Well, that's all we have in the first of our 3 episodes of Future of Global Trade. Our next 2 episodes will focus on India, China, and the opportunities in Latin America. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned to ET Now for the latest in business and market news.